Welcome to Apex Storyteller, your peaceful escape into a world of scary stories that lead you to a restful night. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps me share more soothing tales with you and others. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, settle into your favorite spot, close your eyes, and let's embark on this tranquil journey together. A strange, oppressive hush that seemed to swallow every whisper of life. The railway station, nestled at the edge of a seemingly forgotten town, stood as a monument of desolation. Paint peeled from the wooden benches, the ticket counter was coated with decades of dust, and the air carried a damp, metallic tang, as if the very essence of the place had been left to decay. But tonight, the station was alive with one presence: Carly. Carly hadn't planned to stop here. Her road trip across the Midwest was supposed to be an adventure, a way to clear her mind after her father's passing. But when her car's engine sputtered and died miles from any major highway, the railway station was her only refuge. The flickering neon sign reading Colton Hollow Station was the only thing visible for miles. She had no choice but to approach it. As Carly walked toward the station, her boots crunching on gravel, a strange sensation prickled the back of her neck. The kind you feel when someone is watching you. She stopped, turned, and scanned the darkness. Nothing. Just the vast emptiness of the plains, stretching endlessly under a moonless sky. Shaking off her unease, she stepped onto the station platform. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so. Carly's breath misted as she moved toward the ticket counter, where a lone lamp cast a feeble glow. The place reeked of mildew and something else. Something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. As she examined the counter, she noticed something odd. There were fresh tickets neatly arranged on the desk. Odd, considering the station appeared abandoned. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing off the empty walls. No answer. But then, faintly, she heard it. The sound of a train whistle. Distant, mournful, and wrong. The kind of sound that didn't belong in the present. A chill ran down her spine. She turned toward the tracks, and that's when she saw it. A train was approaching, but there was no light from its engine, no hum of modern machinery. Instead, the train's silhouette emerged from the shadows like a phantom, its carriages long and black, with windows that reflected no light. Carly's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors of the first carriage slid open. "Welcome, Miss Carly," a voice said from within. It was low, gravelly, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Carly's heart thundered. How did they know her name? She took a step back, but the voice spoke again. "You've come so far. It's only fair we help you get where you need to go." The words were hypnotic, almost comforting, yet they carried an undertone of menace. Carly's mind raced. Was this some elaborate prank? Or had she wandered into something far worse? "What is this?" she whispered, barely audible. The voice chuckled. "This is the beginning of your journey. Step inside and all will become clear." Carly wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead she found herself moving forward. The air inside the carriage was warmer than the station, but it carried a weight, a presence that pressed against her chest. The door closed behind her with a hiss, and the train lurched forward. As the train picked up speed, Carly noticed the passengers. Or rather, the lack of them. The seats were occupied, but not by people. Instead, there were shadows, faint and flickering, as if the souls of long-lost travelers had left their mark on this cursed train. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart raced as the realization set in. She wasn't alone. "Where are we going?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The voice returned, colder this time. "Home, Carly. We're going home." The train lurched forward, its wheels screeching against the tracks as it cut through the thick darkness. The air inside the carriage grew heavier, pressing down on Carly with an almost physical weight. She glanced around again, her heart racing. The shadows, faint and flickering, filled the seats as though they had once been occupied by people, but their forms had long since dissipated. There was no warmth, no movement, only the cold emptiness that seemed to stretch on endlessly, like the train itself was not bound by time or space. Carly's breath caught in her throat as the distant hum of the train echoed in her ears. The rhythmic sound of the tracks seemed to soothe her nerves for a moment, but the oppressive silence that filled the gaps between each screech was suffocating. She stared at the aisle ahead, the dim glow from the overhead lamps casting sickly light on the dusty seats and the disembodied shapes sitting in them. The seats themselves were old, faded velvet, their once luxurious fabric now threadbare and worn. The smell of mildew clung to the air, mingling with the faintly metallic scent that she couldn't quite place. A low, gravelly voice broke the silence. "Isn't it a bit late for you, Miss Carly?" She stiffened, every muscle in her body locking into place. It was the same voice from before, the one that had welcomed her onto the train, with its eerie, soothing cadence that still sent chills down her spine. Carly turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the voice. It had come from nowhere, echoing in the empty space as if the walls themselves had spoken. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, moving silently through the carriage. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with long, slender limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally with each step. Dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, deep, midnight blue with brass buttons that gleamed dully in the half-light, the figure moved with an unsettling grace, as though it were gliding rather than walking. Carly's throat went dry. She had to say something, ask something. The questions swirled in her mind like a storm, but her mouth felt paralyzed. She managed to force out a few words, her voice hoarse and weak. What is this place?" The conductor stopped a few feet from her, his face still obscured by the shadows. His eyes, dark and empty like pits of ink, seemed to pierce through her, reading her every thought. The air around him grew colder, a chill that seeped into her bones, making her feel as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss. "This," he said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight, "is the train to the other side. To a place you've always known but never remembered. Everyone who boards here has a reason, whether they understand it or not." Carly's legs wobbled beneath her as she tried to keep her composure. "I don't understand. This isn't real." The conductor chuckled, a sound like dry leaves crunching underfoot. It wasn't a comforting laugh, it was hollow and devoid of any warmth. "Real? Oh, Miss Carly, reality is so subjective. What you call real, what you believe is real, can change with the right perspective." His gaze dropped to her hands, which were trembling by her sides. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between them. Carly instinctively took a step back, but the walls of the train seemed to close in around her, trapping her in the narrow aisle. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did I end up here?" The conductor's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The question isn't why you're here, Miss Carly. The question is, how much of yourself are you willing to lose to get where you need to go? The train doesn't stop at stations, it stops when the journey is over. And yours, well..." He paused, his voice lowering to a whisper, "Yours has just begun." Carly felt a strange pressure in her chest, as if the air itself were thickening, suffocating her. She tried to look away from the conductor's unreadable eyes, but it was as though they were pulling her in, forcing her to see the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. Suddenly, the train gave a sharp, unsettling jolt. Carly stumbled, her hands reaching for the nearest seat to steady herself. The conductor remained perfectly still, unperturbed, as if he had been anticipating the movement. "Where are we going?" Carly asked, her voice laced with panic, her words trembling in the stagnant air. "What happens when the journey ends?" The conductor tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. "To where you need to be, Miss Carly. To the place where all things are revealed. And when it ends, you will understand everything. You'll know who you truly are." Carly felt a knot form in her stomach, a cold dread spreading through her veins. The train sped up, the sound of the wheels clicking faster, and she realized with dawning horror that there was no turning back. The conductor's gaze followed her as she looked out of the window, but all she could see was the darkness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Will I ever leave this train?" she asked, more to herself than to him. The conductor's response was calm, almost rehearsed. "Leave? Oh, Miss Carly, no one truly leaves. Not here." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and Carly's heart sank as the train continued to hurtle through the night, the shadows of the past whispering around her. The train surged forward, its metallic body groaning as it cut through the desolate night. Outside the windows, the world had long since fallen away. There was no sign of the town, no indication that anything had ever existed beyond the tracks. just the endless, crushing blackness that pressed in from all sides. Carly's heartbeat drummed in her ears, her palms slick with cold sweat. The conductor had retreated into the shadows, his dark eyes still burning in her memory. "No one truly leaves," he had said. The words were like a poison, seeping into her thoughts, and now, every breath she took felt suffocating. The carriage was deathly silent except for the soft rhythm of the train's motion. The shadows that had once seemed like figments of her imagination now appeared to shift and move on their own, creeping across the walls as if the very air was alive with some unseen presence. She hugged herself tightly, trying to block out the creeping dread, but it clung to her like a second skin. With no passengers to speak of, the train's emptiness felt oppressive. Each seat was taken, but not by people. By shadows. By something else. Carly could feel their gaze on her, their silent, unseen presence weighing heavily in the air. She swallowed hard, trying to convince herself that she was imagining it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustling of paper in the wind. Carly froze, her blood turning to ice. It came from behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, her neck stiff and tense, her breath shallow. The aisle was empty. But then, at the far end of the carriage, something flickered. A brief shimmer of movement. Carly squinted, her heart thundering in her chest. There, standing in the doorway of the next carriage, was a figure. She jumped to her feet, but her legs were unsteady, trembling beneath her. The figure was tall, like the conductor, but this one was different. His outline seemed to distort, as if he wasn't quite real. The flickering light of the train cast long shadows across his face, but there was something unsettling about him. Something that felt wrong, even unnatural. His eyes were hollow, like deep pits, yet they glowed faintly, a dull amber that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. "Who are you?" Carly's voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound lost in the vastness of the train. The figure didn't speak, but instead began to move toward her. Each step was slow, deliberate, and somehow graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. Carly took a step back, her breath quickening, but her legs wouldn't move any faster. The figure's eyes never left hers as it came closer, its movement fluid and unnatural. "You shouldn't be here." The voice that came from the figure was not a whisper, but a deep, resonant tone, as if it came from the very walls of the train itself. Carly felt it vibrate inside her chest, a low hum that seemed to pierce into her soul. "Why?" Carly managed to choke out, her voice trembling in spite of herself. "Why am I here?" The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, like the world was pressing in from all directions. Carly's skin crawled as the figure leaned closer, its cold breath ghosting over her face. Because the figure's voice was a low murmur, "You are searching for something. But once you begin this journey, there is no end. Only more questions. And no answers." Carly's stomach churned. "I don't understand." "You will," the figure said, its voice gaining strength, almost as though it were feeding off her fear. "Sooner or later you will understand." It took another step closer, and Carly felt the air around her grow heavier. The shadows in the carriage seemed to gather, coalescing into darker shapes, pressing in from all sides. Her pulse raced, her mind fighting against the overwhelming sensation that the walls were closing in. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice small, her hands shaking at her sides. The figure didn't answer. Instead, its glowing eyes seemed to darken, narrowing as it leaned even closer. For a moment, Carly thought it might speak again, but then it simply stepped back, vanishing into the darkness of the next carriage. The air grew lighter as it disappeared, but the dread remained, lingering like a fog. Carly was left standing in the aisle, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to steady herself, but the fear, this cold, gnawing fear, had taken root deep inside her chest. The figure's words echoed in her mind. "You will understand." Her body refused to cooperate. She wanted to run, to escape this place, but her legs were like stone, her feet rooted to the floor. The train continued to rumble, its constant motion a reminder that there was no stopping it. No way off, no way to return. She looked out the window, desperate for some sign of life, some indication that the world outside was still there. But all she saw was darkness, a vast, infinite void, stretching out beyond the reach of her vision. The world had slipped away, and she was alone in a train that didn't belong to any place she recognized. The train's lights flickered. For a brief moment, the carriage seemed to dissolve into shadow and Carly's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her mind, but when her eyes refocused, the figure was there again. Only this time, it wasn't standing in the doorway. It was sitting in one of the seats, its eyes fixed on her, its body still, its presence suffocating. Carly's heart skipped a beat as the figure slowly tilted its head to one side, its glowing eyes boring into hers. "You're not alone, Carly," it whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "But you will be soon." Carly stumbled back, her hands instinctively reaching for the nearest seat to steady herself. She turned to run but froze. The figure in the seat was now beside her. The train hadn't stopped, but time had. The world seemed to stretch and pull, and Carly felt herself slipping further and further into a darkness that wasn't just outside, it was inside her mind, consuming her from within. Carly's thoughts were a whirlwind, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the figure's words pressing against her, each one sinking deeper into her mind. "You're not alone, Carly, but you will be soon." The voice had been cold, detached, as if it knew something she didn't, something she wasn't ready to understand. But the chilling certainty in its words couldn't be ignored. The feeling of isolation, the sensation that something terrible was about to happen, tightened around her like a vice. The train kept moving, an endless, rhythmic clatter that reverberated through her bones. She pressed her hand to the cool glass of the window, her fingers trembling as she gazed out into the void. The darkness outside was absolute, a vast and impenetrable sea. There was no sign of stars, no moon, just the oppressive blackness stretching endlessly, as though time itself had been swallowed whole. Carly turned her back to the window, trying to pull herself together. The figure was gone, but she could still feel its presence lingering, as though it had never truly left. The shadows in the carriage seemed to pulse, shifting with an almost unnatural rhythm, as if the train itself were breathing. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unsettling thoughts that swirled in her mind. But then the train came to a sudden halt. Carly stumbled forward, her body jerking with the momentum of the stop. She caught herself against one of the worn leather seats, her pulse racing. The lights flickered, dimming for a moment before snapping back to full brightness, casting harsh, unnatural light across the carriage. The air grew heavier again, colder, as though the very atmosphere had changed. Carly's breath came out in uneven gasps as she stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. The doors at the far end of the carriage slid open with a groan, revealing a narrow corridor. Carly's instinct was to run, to escape whatever lay ahead, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Her mind screamed at her to move, but something else held her in place. A deep, unshakable compulsion to step forward, to walk down that corridor. With great effort, she forced herself to move. Her legs felt like lead as she took a step, then another, each footfall echoing louder than the last in the stillness of the train. The corridor was long, stretching into the darkness, the walls closing in around her. The shadows seemed to creep along the edges, stretching unnaturally in the dim light. The ceiling above her was low, almost oppressive, as if the train were shrinking, becoming smaller with every passing second. The air grew colder still, and Carly could feel the chill seep through her clothes, biting into her skin. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the sensation of being watched, the sensation that she was not alone. She could hear faint whispers now, not from any one voice, but a chorus of murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, their breath mingling with hers. She stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but still unintelligible, like distant conversations she couldn't quite hear. Carly's breath quickened as she looked around, searching for the source of the voices, but the corridor was empty, except for the door at the end. It stood there, dark and ominous, a gaping black hole in the distance, waiting for her to approach. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind that door, a soft, beckoning hum that she couldn't ignore. Carly's legs refused to move any further, but her body, driven by some primal instinct, began to carry her forward, step by slow, unsteady step. When she reached the door, she didn't touch the handle. Instead, it opened on its own, the wood groaning as it slid back to reveal a room that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. The walls of the room were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and smeared with dust. At the center of the room was a large, circular table, its surface covered in strange symbols and carvings that seemed to writhe and shift as Carly stared at them. A figure was seated at the table. Carly's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was the same as before, tall, dark, with glowing amber eyes that seemed to burn with an unsettling intensity. But this time it wasn't just standing in the doorway. It was seated, motionless, its hands resting on the table. "You've come," the figure's voice reverberated through the room, its tone deep and unfeeling, as though it were speaking not to her, but through her. "Where am I?" Carly managed to croak, her voice hoarse from the weight of fear that had settled in her throat. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it raised one hand, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Slowly, the mirrors along the walls began to shift, reflecting her own image back at her in twisted, distorted forms. In one, she was older, worn, weary, as if time had taken its toll. In another, she was a child again, her face covered in tears, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't remember feeling. The mirrors shifted again, and now there were multiple versions of her, all staring back, all showing something different, something lost. "What is this?" Carly whispered, her voice trembling. "This is the passage," the figure said, its voice softer now, but still carrying the same oppressive weight. "This is where all paths converge, where all truths are revealed. But not all truths are meant to be known." Carly backed away, her mind reeling. She tried to turn, to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the mirrors. The whispers from outside the room had become louder now, frantic, as if they were warning her, urging her to leave before it was too late. But it was too late. The mirrors began to flicker, and Carly's reflection changed again. This time, she saw herself sitting at the table, her hands gripping the surface as if in some sort of trance. Her face was empty, her eyes dull, as though she were no longer the person she had been when she first boarded the train. The reflection in the mirror was a shell, an empty vessel. The figure stood up slowly, moving toward her with unnatural fluidity. It came closer, its presence overwhelming. Carly's body was no longer her own. She was trapped in the reflection, trapped in the room, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "Soon, Carly," the figure whispered, its voice now a low, seductive murmur. "Soon you will understand the price of this journey." Carly screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence of the room. The mirrors reflected her scream, but they didn't echo. They simply absorbed it. Carly's pulse pounded in her ears, the rhythmic thudding a constant companion as she stood in the suffocating room of mirrors. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices pressing in from all sides, seeping into her mind like poison. The figure before her was no longer a distant shadow but a presence that seemed to fill the very air, its eyes burning into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against the table, but it felt wrong, cold and slick, as though the wood had absorbed all the heat in the room. Her fingers curled into the grooves of the strange symbols etched into its surface, and the moment she touched them, the world around her seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of something ancient and unseen. The mirrors trembled, their reflections warping and bending like ripples on water, pulling her in deeper. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the room as the symbols on the table began to glow, their once faint etchings now burning with an unearthly light. Carly's breath caught in her throat. She felt as if she were being drawn into the very essence of the train, as if its dark, twisting path was somehow tangled with her fate. Every inch of her body screamed to escape, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She was no longer just a passenger, she was part of something far greater, something darker. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, lost amidst the clamor of the whispers. The figure, this entity that had guided her, twisted her path, took a slow step forward, its silhouette flickering like a dying flame. "The hollow," it said, its voice soft but chilling. "You are not the first to seek passage here. You are not the first to cross the line between life and death." Carly's heart skipped a beat. Life and death? The air seemed to freeze, the words hanging in the stillness like a curse. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. The mirrors around her pulsed with the rhythm of her heart, the reflections of her own fear and confusion multiplied in every direction. "You've entered the hollow," the figure continued, its tone now laced with something resembling pity. "A place where those who seek escape from the past are lost forever. A place where time folds in on itself, where the living and the dead are bound by invisible threads, and where your soul, Your soul will either find rest or be condemned to wander in endless darkness. Carly's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor. Her head spun, the weight of its words pressing down on her chest like a vice. She hadn't believed in ghosts, hadn't believed in curses, in anything beyond the tangible. But now the world seemed to crumble around her. She could feel the weight of the place, the oppressive atmosphere, the dark presence closing in, and it terrified her in a way she hadn't felt before. The train rumbled beneath her feet, the sound of its movement reverberating through her bones. The air thickened and Carly's breath came in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a chorus, each voice seeming to claw at her thoughts. Leave, go back. The voice of the figure was the only one that pierced through the storm of sound. You cannot leave, Carly. Not yet. The train doesn't take you where you want to go. It takes you where you need to go. She shook her head, her mind reeling. I don't understand. What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head, its eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of sorrow and hunger. The same thing it wants from all who board. A price. A toll. A decision. Carly's heart skipped a beat as the word settled in. A decision? What kind of decision? The figure stepped closer, its shadow swallowing the light. You will choose, Carly. You will choose whether to embrace what you've left behind, or to sever it completely. If you choose to leave, there will be no turning back. If you choose to stay, you will become one with this place, a part of its endless, shifting reality. And should you choose neither, you will remain here, lost, forever caught between two worlds, waiting for something that may never come. The words were like a cold dagger driven into her chest. Carly's mind raced, each second stretching into eternity as she tried to grasp the gravity of the decision laid before her. What could she do? How could she choose between something she didn't understand and a fate that seemed worse than death itself? Suddenly, the train shuddered violently, throwing her off balance. She caught herself on the table, her breath ragged as she tried to steady herself. The lights above flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the room. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze, the train's movement halting as if time itself had been suspended. And then the mirrors began to change. They no longer reflected just Carly's image. Now they showed images of the past, flashes of moments she had long buried, things she had forgotten, things she never wanted to remember. Her father's funeral, the darkened room where she had sat alone, her tears mixing with the rain that pounded against the window. Her childhood home, the walls stained with the memories of happiness long since faded. Each mirror was a doorway into another life, another version of herself, each one demanding her attention. The figure stepped into the center of the room, its dark silhouette towering over her. The decision is yours, Carly. Will you continue running from the past? Or will you confront it, embrace it, and finally let go? Her breath caught as she stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She glanced at the mirrors, at the images that seemed to call out to her, the faces she hadn't seen in years. She could feel them, her past, her memories, her regrets, gathering around her, threatening to swallow her whole. But in that moment, Carly realized something. She didn't have to choose. Not yet. The hollow, the train, the figure, they were all just manifestations of her fear, of her inability to move forward. This was a test, one she couldn't let control her. She would face her past, confront it, and reclaim her own future. She wasn't going to let the train or whatever it was define her. With a deep, steadying breath, Carly turned toward the mirrors. I'm not afraid anymore, she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm not running. Not this time. The figure's eyes narrowed, the shadows deepening. It let out a soft laugh, a sound that was both unsettling and knowing. Then we shall see, it said, its voice echoing as the world around her began to shift once again. Carly's mind spun as the world around her contorted and shifted. The moment she faced the mirrors, her reflection seemed to fracture, splintering into countless pieces, each shard a different version of herself. It was as if the very fabric of her being had been torn apart and scattered into the wind, leaving her to pick up the pieces. The figure before her had disappeared, but its presence lingered like a shadow in the corner of her mind. The room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers had returned, a chorus of voices that swirled around her in an endless loop. They spoke in languages she didn't understand, in tones both pleading and mocking, as if the hollow itself had a life of its own, a consciousness that reveled in her confusion. She took a step forward, her feet moving instinctively, drawn toward the mirrors. Each reflection seemed to pull at her, as if reaching out to grab hold of her soul. The faces in the glass were not her own, but fragments of people she'd known, memories she thought were lost. Her mother, long gone, stood smiling in one mirror, her eyes sparkling with warmth. In another, her father stood with his back to her, his form flickering like a ghost, the expression on his face unreadable. But in all the mirrors there was one constant: her. She was trapped in the hollow. There was no escaping it, not without facing the truth, whatever that was. The more she looked, the more she felt herself slipping away, like sand through her fingers. Was this the test? Was this what she had to face before she could leave? No, Carly whispered to herself, shaking her head. This isn't real. None of this is real. But even as she spoke, she felt the cold, the weight, the pressure of the hollow pressing down on her. The whispers were growing louder, louder than her own thoughts, until they drowned out everything else. Her breath caught in her throat, the air so thick with dread that it felt like she was suffocating. And then, as if answering her unspoken thoughts, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The mirrors shattered, the pieces falling away like glass rain. Carly screamed, but no sound came. Her world was consumed by darkness, the shadows wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The train, the hollow, the figure, it all blurred together in a rush of disorienting noise and confusion. When the world finally stilled, Carly was no longer standing in the room of mirrors. She was outside. The air was different now, drier, harsher. She was standing on the edge of a vast desert, the ground beneath her feet cracked and dry, as if the earth itself had been scorched by the heat of 1,000 suns. The sky above was an eerie shade of crimson, as if the sun had never fully set, casting a strange, oppressive glow over the barren landscape. There were no signs of life here, no trees, no animals, nothing but sand and the whispering winds that carried a chill as sharp as a knife. And in the distance, the train was waiting. It stood on the tracks like a dark monolith, its black carriages looming against the horizon. There was something unnerving about it, something that made Carly's heart pound in her chest, as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. It was so still, so silent, yet she could feel it calling to her, beckoning her to step inside. But she knew better than to trust it. "Where am I?" she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse from the dry air. Her feet felt heavy, as though the very weight of the desert was trying to pull her down. She looked around, hoping for some sign, some answer, but all she saw was endless sand stretching out in every direction. As she stood there, her eyes locked onto the train, a flicker of movement caught her attention. Something, or someone, was standing by the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. She couldn't make out their features, but there was a strange familiarity to the figure. It was as if she knew them, or at least had known them in another life, another time. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the figure stepped forward, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. It was then that Carly recognized the figure. Her father. Her heart stopped. But this wasn't the man she remembered. He was different now. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that was more of a grimace, a reflection of something twisted and dark. "Dad?" Carly's voice cracked, the word tasting foreign in her mouth. "Is it really you?" Her father didn't respond. Instead, he extended his hand toward her, his fingers trembling in the air as if urging her to take it. But Carly couldn't move. Her legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot by a force she couldn't comprehend. "You don't belong here, Carly," her father's voice echoed, but it wasn't the voice she remembered. It was distorted, warped by something darker. "You should never have come." "Why?" Carly demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "Why did you leave me? Why am I here?" Her father's smile widened, his face twisting into something monstrous. "Because you weren't supposed to stay. You were supposed to move on, to forget. But you couldn't. You stayed in the past, and the past has a way of coming back for you." The ground beneath Carly's feet trembled, and the wind howled louder, carrying the sound of a distant train whistle, its eerie tone echoing across the vast emptiness. She could feel it in her bones. The hollow was closing in, and she was running out of time. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice steady, defiant. "I won't let you control me." But as the words left her mouth, her father's figure flickered, distorting like a mirage. The desert around her seemed to pulse with energy, the colors shifting, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. The train was growing closer, its dark shape looming larger, its whistle growing louder, drowning out everything else. In that moment, Carly knew what she had to do. She had to face her past, her regrets, her pain, her father's death, and leave them behind. The hollow would never let her go unless she did. With a final glance at the fading figure of her father, Carly turned and ran toward the train. The hollow had come for her. But Carly was done running. The sound of the train's whistle reverberated through the desert, an ominous call that seemed to draw Carly closer to the tracks. Every step she took felt heavier, the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the dry air burning in her lungs as the train loomed ahead, its black carriages stretching endlessly into the distance. The darkness of the train seemed to swallow the world around her, and Carly could feel the pull of it, a force that threatened to drag her into the void. But she was no longer the same person she had been when she first stepped into the hollow. The haunting memories of her father, of everything she had lost, had begun to dissolve in the heat of the desert sun. She no longer needed the answers the hollow promised. She no longer needed to be consumed by the past. She had come to realize that she was the one who controlled her destiny, not the hollow. The wind picked up, swirling around her in a frenzy, pushing her forward as if the desert itself was urging her on. The train was now only a few yards away, its shadow looming over her like a dark veil. The figure of her father had vanished, his presence fading into the wind, leaving behind only a sense of emptiness. Carly felt her heart race, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was determination. She reached the edge of the tracks, her feet finally coming to a stop as she stood before the train. The doors slid open, revealing the same eerie darkness that had filled the train when she first stepped aboard. But this time she didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. She knew that stepping onto the train meant surrendering to the hollow's grip, but it was the only way to break free. With a deep breath, Carly stepped onto the train, her footfall echoing in the empty space. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to face the dim interior, her eyes adjusting to the low light. The train was as it had been before, empty, cold, and lifeless. But now it felt different. There was no oppressive weight in the air, no malevolent presence lurking in the corners. It was simply quiet. For the first time, Carly felt a flicker of hope. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps barely making a sound on the worn wooden floors. There was no sign of the ghostly passengers that had filled the train earlier. The carriages seemed endless, stretching forward in a way that defied logic. But this time, Carly wasn't afraid. She knew what she had to do. She had to face the hollow head-on, to reclaim the parts of herself she had left behind. As she moved through the train, she noticed a door at the far end, a door she had not seen before. It was different from the others, its wood old and weathered, but there was something about it that drew her in. She approached it, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The moment she touched it, a jolt of energy coursed through her, a shock that rattled her very bones. She pulled the door open and stepped through. The world beyond the door was unlike anything she had seen before. The desert was gone, replaced by a vast, endless sky. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a soft golden light over everything. The air was cool and fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the desert. The landscape stretched out before her, lush and green, with towering trees and sparkling rivers that twisted and turned through the land. It was a place of peace, a place of healing. Carly took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the hollow lift from her shoulders. The pain, the guilt, the fear, they were all fading, dissolving into the soft light of this new world. She felt free, lighter than she had in years, as if a burden had been lifted from her soul. But even as she basked in the beauty of this new realm, she knew that her journey wasn't over. The hollow had been a test, a dark reflection of herself that had forced her to confront her past and face her deepest fears. It was a trial, one she had passed not by fighting but by letting go. Carly looked up at the sky, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had come to terms with the loss of her father, with the pain of her past, and now she could move forward. The hollow had no hold on her anymore. She was free. But then a voice, soft, familiar, and filled with warmth, whispered on the breeze. "Carly." Her father's voice. She turned around, and there, standing at the edge of the new world, was the figure of her father. This time, he was different. His face was peaceful, serene, no longer haunted by the darkness that had clouded it before. His smile was kind, his eyes full of love and understanding. "It's time," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything she had ever needed to hear. "You've made it. You've found your peace." Carly stepped forward, her heart brimming with emotion. "I'm ready," she whispered, the words a promise to herself, to the past, and to the future. Her father reached out a hand and Carly took it, her fingers closing around his in a gentle grip. Together they walked into the light, the world around them glowing with a warmth that felt like home. And as they disappeared into the horizon, the train stood silent, waiting for its next passenger, its next soul to guide through the hollow. But Carly had already found her way out. The wind had died down and the desert was quiet once more. The tracks lay empty, the train long gone, and yet the hollow remained, waiting for its next traveler. The whispers had faded into nothingness, and the world had returned to its natural rhythm. But somewhere in the far distance, a single train whistle echoed, a faint reminder of the journey Carly had taken, of the darkness she had faced and the peace she had found. In the end, the hollow was not just a place. It was a mirror, a reflection of one's deepest fears and regrets, a journey that could only be completed when one was ready to face the past and let it go. Carly had done that, and in doing so, she had freed herself. The hollow was waiting for someone else now, someone new. But Carly was free. And for the first time in a long time, she could finally rest. The town of Waverly, nestled at the edge of a thick, mysterious forest, was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. Its cobblestone streets wound lazily between homes painted in faded pastel colors, each one sitting proudly as if they had never been touched by time's cruel hand. The small town square, with its old iron lampposts and cracked fountain, gave off an air of quaint nostalgia, as if it belonged to a time long forgotten. Yet, despite its charm, there was something unsettling about Waverly, a hidden pulse beneath its picturesque exterior, a rhythm out of sync with the rest of the world. Every night, as the clock tower in the heart of the town struck 11:11 p.m., something began to happen. It wasn't the chiming of the clock itself that was strange. No, it was the peculiar stillness that followed. The clock, a proud and ancient structure that had marked the passage of time for centuries, would toll once, twice, 3 times, but on the 11th stroke, it would ring 12 times instead of 1. The chimes resonated deep into the bones of the town, a sound so rich and haunting that it reverberated through the very air. And when the bell stopped ringing, so did everything else. The bustling town, so full of life just moments before, would suddenly fall silent. The laughter in the streets would cease, the faint hum of conversation from the cafes would die away, and the glow of the streetlights would dim as if they were afraid to shine too brightly. In that moment of stillness, Waverly ceased to be a town. It became a place lost in time, trapped in an unspoken moment of quiet dread. The strange hour had arrived. It was said that those who had been in Waverly long enough knew better than to ask questions about it. To question the hour was to invite misfortune, to stir the strange, inexplicable force that seemed to govern the town. In hushed voices, the older residents would share their own experiences, but never aloud, never too loud. Always in whispers. Some believed it was the curse of an ancient ritual gone wrong. Others thought it was the result of a secret long kept by the town's founders, a pact made with forces unknown. The stories were as varied as the people who told them, but they all shared one thing in common. None of the stories ended well. And no one, absolutely no one, was brave enough to try and uncover the truth. But Emily was different. She was new to Waverly, having recently moved there after accepting a job at the local newspaper, the Waverly Gazette. She had always been the curious type, the kind to question everything around her, even when it was inconvenient. And though the town's strange reputation had unsettled her in the beginning, she had quickly dismissed the rumors as nothing more than the wild imaginings of small-town folk. After all, she had seen her fair share of weirdness in the world of journalism, and she had learned not to believe everything she heard. But something about this town, something about the hour, gnawed at her. It wasn't just the strange silence that followed the clock tower's chimes. It was the feeling, an electric tension in the air, a thick sense of anticipation that seemed to weigh on everything like the calm before a storm. Every night, when the clock struck 11:11 p.m., Emily would find herself staring out her window, wondering what would happen next. And then, just as the town's pulse seemed to stop, she would find herself in the same trance-like state as everyone else. Her curiosity was driving her mad. She had to know what was really happening at that hour. So, on one stormy night, an evening when the winds howled and the skies were split open with jagged streaks of lightning, Emily decided it was time to investigate. She had heard the rumors, the whispers, but now it was her turn to uncover the truth. She couldn't let the town's mystery fester any longer. The clock tower loomed over the town square, a silent sentinel that towered above the otherwise unassuming buildings. She could see it clearly from her apartment window, the ancient structure with its weathered face, its intricate metal hands frozen in time at 11:11 p.m. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against her window with a furious intensity, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Emily stood by the window, her heart beating faster with every second. She wasn't sure why, but there was a weight in the air tonight, something heavier than usual. The storm outside seemed to mirror the unease building inside her. She watched as the clock's second hand ticked down, inching ever closer to the dreaded hour. The town was still. No one was out in the streets, no children playing, no shopkeepers closing up their stores. It was as if they all knew what was coming and had long since retreated to the safety of their homes. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the clock struck 11:11. She had heard the chimes before, of course, everyone had. But tonight there was something different about them. They seemed louder, more resonant, as if the sound were reaching deep inside her chest. The vibrations of the bells seemed to seep into her bones. Chime, chime, chime. Then came the 11th chime. Chime. It was at that moment that everything went still. The storm outside, which had been howling just moments before, seemed to stop abruptly. The rain, which had been pounding against the windows, fell away into a heavy, unsettling silence. Emily's breath hitched. She stared out the window, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the cold glass. The streetlights outside flickered once, twice, and then went dark. In the square, the fountain's water, which had been trickling all evening, ceased. Even the trees swayed unnaturally still, as if the very air had been drained of life. And then a noise. A low, distant sound, like a faint whisper, came from the heart of the town square. It was impossible to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she turned away from the window, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. And then her phone rang. The ringtone, so loud against the thick silence, made her jump. She hesitated for a moment before answering. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, an unlisted number. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling slightly. A deep, raspy voice crackled through the receiver. "Get away from the window. Now." Before she could respond, the call ended. She stood frozen for a moment, heart racing, unsure of what just happened. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter, but she could hear nothing but the eerie quiet of the world outside. Then she heard it. A soft, nearly inaudible sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her door. Emily stood frozen in place, the phone still pressed against her ear, her mind racing. The voice on the other end had been so low, so urgent, "Get away from the window. Now," that it sent a chill through her entire body. Her heart pounded like a drumbeat in her chest, louder and louder with each passing second. She glanced toward the window, the world outside now shrouded in an eerie stillness. Had she heard footsteps? She wasn't sure, but the air around her felt heavy, oppressive, as though something was drawing closer, inch by creeping inch. The quiet was unnatural, too perfect, and in that silence, her instincts screamed at her to move. She turned slowly, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling, and her breath caught in her throat. The door to her apartment was cracked open, just a sliver, and from the narrow gap she could see a shadow. The shadow was too tall, too still. Emily's pulse quickened as her fingers instinctively tightened around the phone in her hand. She wanted to shout, to call for help, but the words caught in her throat. She took a slow, measured step back, her breath shallow, her mind racing for an explanation. Was it a prank? Or something worse? Then the shadow moved. A figure emerged from the dark hallway, and Emily's heart stopped. The man in the doorway. He stood motionless, his form so tall that his head nearly brushed the top of the doorframe. His face, though shadowed, was unervingly pale, an unnatural shade of white, almost translucent, as if the moon itself had drained the color from his skin. His eyes, hidden beneath the weight of a hood, glowed faintly, like two embers barely keeping the darkness at bay. Emily could feel a shiver race up her spine. How long had he been standing there? The figure didn't speak, didn't move, but there was something unmistakable in his presence. An unholy stillness that seemed to warp the air around him. Time itself seemed to stretch, elongating every second into an eternity. A bead of sweat trickled down Emily's forehead as she instinctively backed away. She moved toward the kitchen, her feet light, barely touching the floor, as if any noise might alert him to her movements. But before she could make it any further, the man's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "You don't have to run," he said, his voice smooth, low, and strangely hypnotic. It reverberated through the walls as though it didn't come from his mouth but from the very air itself. "There's nowhere to hide." Her breath hitched in her throat. How did he know? Her eyes darted around the apartment, her mind frantically searching for a way out. She wasn't sure if he was referring to the physical space or if he knew something far worse. The hour, the storm, the disappearance of the town. The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice now laced with an eerie, mocking amusement. The hour. The vanishing. The silence. Emily's legs trembled beneath her. He knew. He knew exactly what had been happening in Waverly every night at 11:11. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she finally managed to speak, her voice a mere whisper. "What do you want from me?" The man's smile deepened, his eyes glowing brighter now, as though he drew energy from her fear. "I want to show you the truth," he replied cryptically. "You're asking the wrong questions, Emily. It's not about what I want, it's about what you need to see." Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. The same chill that had gripped her earlier returned with a vengeance. She couldn't take her eyes off the man, who was still watching her with those unnatural, burning eyes. What was happening? Without thinking, she reached for the phone, her trembling fingers barely managing to unlock the screen. She glanced at the number, the same as before. The voice on the other end was the same too, but this time it was more urgent, more frantic. "Get out of the apartment. Now," the voice hissed. "The door isn't the only thing that's open. He can get in. He can get you." The call ended abruptly, leaving only the echo of the voice's warning ringing in her ears. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath quickening. The figure in the doorway had not moved, but there was something now, something new, in his gaze. It wasn't just the quiet, calculating intensity. There was a hunger in those eyes, a palpable, almost predatory desire. His mouth moved again, but this time there was no mocking smile, no eerily calm tone. It was different. "You think you can stop it, don't you? But once you've seen, there's no going back. No one leaves Waverly after the hour. No one escapes the truth." The storm outside seemed to intensify in that moment, as though the weather itself could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The rain hammered against the windows and the wind howled louder, bending the trees in unnatural angles. The world outside had become a violent, chaotic mess, but inside all that mattered was the man in the doorway. Emily's mind raced, panic gripping her throat. She had no choice but to act. Without thinking, she darted toward the door, her legs carrying her with a speed that surprised even her. But as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. No way out. She turned, facing the figure who had not moved, but now seemed even closer, as though the distance between them had closed in a fraction of a second. His voice, no longer smooth but filled with an unmistakable dark promise, whispered, "There's no escape. Not from him. Not from the hour." As the last words left his lips, Emily felt her pulse race faster. In that moment, she realized that whatever was happening in Waverly had just begun to pull her into its web. The storm, the silence, the man, none of it was coincidence. And the truth she had been seeking was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen, the heavy weight of the man's presence pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The storm outside howled with renewed fury, but inside, the apartment was disturbingly still. The flickering light from the lamp cast long, twitching shadows across the room, making it seem as though the walls themselves were breathing, moving, watching her. The figure in the doorway hadn't moved, but his eyes, those glowing, unnerving eyes, never left her. His expression was unreadable, like a mask carved from stone, yet there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood, perfectly still but undeniably present. Emily's heart raced, each beat a frantic reminder of how close she was to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Then, without warning, the man stepped forward. It wasn't a movement. It was more like the air around him shifted, bending and warping as though his very presence altered the fabric of reality. He was no longer in the doorway. He was right there, standing in the middle of the room, too close, his face a mere breath away from hers. "You think you're still in control, don't you?" His voice had changed, no longer a calm, calculated whisper, but something deeper, more resonant, like a forgotten echo from another time. It seemed to vibrate the very air, sending an electric tingle down her spine. Emily instinctively took a step back, her eyes darting to the nearest exit, but the door was still firmly closed. She looked around frantically, but the walls seemed to close in, the space shrinking around her like a vice. There was nowhere to run, no escape from the oppressive presence that seemed to consume the room. "Why are you here?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper, as though the very act of speaking could shatter the fragile thread of reality she clung to. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was thin, predatory, and it stretched unnaturally across his pale face. "You know why," he said, his tone dripping with dark amusement. "You've seen the signs, heard the whispers, felt the hour." Emily's pulse quickened as she stepped back again, her mind swirling with a million questions. How could he know? How could he possibly know what had been happening in the town? The hour, the vanishing, the disappearances. Everything had seemed like a bad dream, a nightmare that she could wake up from. But this was real. "Tell me what you want," Emily demanded, her voice growing steadier despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Why are you here? What is it you want from me?" The man's smile never faltered as he took another step closer, and this time, Emily didn't back away. She was done running. Her legs felt like jelly beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall, to face him. "I'm not here for you," he said slowly, his voice softening into something almost intimate. "I'm here for what you'll become." Her mind raced, trying to process his words. What she would become. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "What will I become?" The man's eyes gleamed in the dim light, his gaze never leaving hers. "The hour doesn't care who you are," he said. "It doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't care if you understand. All that matters is that you're here and you've seen it. You've stepped into the void, Emily." Before she could respond, there was a sudden, harsh knock on the door. The sound was loud, intrusive, shattering the fragile silence that had enveloped the apartment. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her eyes snapping toward the door. For a moment, she almost thought she'd imagined it, until the knock came again, louder, more insistent. The man didn't react, didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on hers, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something dark and ancient in the depths of his eyes. But she couldn't focus on that now. She had to act. Her hand shot out to the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. The knock echoed again, a rapid, frantic series of thuds that seemed to make the walls tremble. Emily didn't hesitate this time. She swung the door open, expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps a police officer standing on the other side. But there was no one, just the darkness of the hallway beyond. The apartment seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unexplainable weight. The doorframe distorted, warping as though reality itself was bending. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the hallway, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the empty apartment. Then she heard it. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, from the direction of the stairs. It wasn't a sound that came from any one person. It was as if the entire building had begun to whisper to her. The voices were faint at first, barely a murmur, but they grew louder as she turned toward the stairs. Words she couldn't quite understand, but somehow they felt familiar, like fragments of a long-lost memory. "Get out." The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Get out while you still can." Emily's pulse raced, the terror crawling up her throat like a rising tide. But something compelled her forward, urged her toward the stairs, the unknown, the source of the whispering voices. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force drawing her into the darkness below. The man's voice reached her ears once more, its hollow, mocking tone sending a shiver through her body. "You can't run from what's already inside you. The hour is closer than you think, Emily. You've crossed the threshold. Now there's no turning back." As if in response to his words, the hallway light flickered and went out, plunging her into complete darkness. Emily stood there for a long moment, her breath shallow, her mind reeling. The whispering voices had stopped. The only sound now was the frantic beating of her heart, and the knowledge that the hour was coming. She couldn't stop it, but she could still fight. With her heart hammering in her chest, Emily took her first step into the darkness. The truth was waiting, and it was closer than she ever could have imagined. Emily's steps were slow and deliberate as she descended the darkened stairs, each one creaking beneath her weight like a warning. The hallway stretched ahead, the shadows thickening as she moved deeper into the belly of the building. Every whisper, every strange sound, seemed to echo off the walls, amplifying the disorienting sense of being watched. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and the dim light of the basement flickered to life, casting long shadows against the cold concrete floor. The room before her felt like a forgotten relic, a place untouched by time. Old wooden crates were stacked against the walls, their surfaces covered in layers of dust. A thick, musty scent lingered in the air, mingling with the faint smell of something metallic, something she couldn't quite place. Her eyes scanned the space, trying to make sense of it. In the far corner, an old, full-length mirror stood. Its frame was intricately carved, dark wood twisted into strange, almost unnatural patterns. The mirror's surface, however, was marred by a thick layer of grime, distorting the reflection. Yet something about it seemed different. The air around it felt heavier, like it was pulling her in. The whispering had stopped, but she still felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes upon her. They were in the room waiting. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step toward the mirror. A part of her screamed to turn back, to escape whatever was lurking here. But the other part, the part that had already crossed too many lines, that had stepped into the unknown, urged her forward. Her fingers brushed the edge of the mirror's frame, the wood cold and slick under her touch. For a brief moment she hesitated, unsure of what she was about to do. But then the air seemed to thicken, pushing her hand forward, almost guiding her. When her fingers touched the glass, something shifted. The world around her seemed to sway, the basement blurring as if the very fabric of reality was warping. Emily's stomach lurched as she tried to pull her hand away, but it wouldn't move. It was as though the mirror was holding her captive, refusing to release her from its grip. Her pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her ears as the air grew unbearably cold. In the reflection, her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't quite right. Her features seemed off, distorted, as if someone had stretched and twisted her image just beyond recognition. The corners of her mouth turned upwards into a grotesque, unnatural smile, and her eyes, those weren't her eyes. They were empty, hollow, dark pits that seemed to gaze into her very soul. She yanked her hand away, stumbling back with a gasp. The world around her snapped back into focus, the basement suddenly feeling too small, too cramped. She blinked, heart hammering in her chest, as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. That smile, those eyes, they weren't just a trick of the light. They were real. A voice, faint yet unmistakable, whispered from behind her. "You shouldn't have touched it, Emily." She spun around, but there was no one there. Her skin crawled as she realized the voice hadn't come from any one person. It was everywhere, surrounding her, invading her thoughts, echoing inside her head. "You are already part of it," the voice continued, growing louder, clearer. "The hour is here. The time has come to join us." Emily's breath came in quick gasps as she backed away, her mind racing for a way out. What was happening? What had happened? She had crossed some line, stepped into something she couldn't comprehend, and now she was a part of it. The air in the basement grew even colder, and the shadows lengthened, stretching toward her like long, clawed fingers. She turned toward the stairs, but they were no longer the way out. The door at the top was gone, replaced by a solid, impenetrable wall. Panic surged through her chest as she frantically searched the room for an escape. Her eyes fell upon the mirror again. This time it wasn't her reflection staring back. It was something else. A figure emerged from the glass, stepping through the surface as though it were water. A tall, thin figure draped in a cloak of darkness, its features hidden beneath a hood that seemed to absorb the light around it. It moved with unnatural fluidity, gliding toward her without a sound, its presence a cold, suffocating force. "You shouldn't have touched it," the figure said again, its voice soft, almost gentle. But there was something terribly wrong about it, like the sound of 1,000 voices speaking as one. Emily felt her knees weaken, her breath stuttering in her throat. The air around her seemed to pulse, to throb with a strange energy, as if the very space had become alive with malevolent intent. She wasn't sure if the figure was real or a product of her fear, but it was too real, too tangible to ignore. "What do you want from me?" Emily managed to whisper, her voice shaking with terror. The figure tilted its head slightly, its eyes, if you could call them that, gleaming from beneath the hood. "You already know, Emily. You've always known." It reached out, its hand cold and dark, stretching toward her with slow, deliberate movements. Emily stumbled backward, her chest tight with panic. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. But the room seemed to close in on her, and the figure's outstretched hand grew closer, inches away from her trembling skin. Just as it was about to touch her, a loud crash echoed through the basement, shattering the stillness. Emily jerked around to find a man standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the stairs. He was breathing heavily, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Emily," he shouted, his voice desperate. "Get away from the mirror." The figure froze. Emily didn't know who this man was or how he knew her name, but she didn't care. Without thinking, she ran toward him, her heart pounding in her chest as she darted past the figure and through the door. The figure didn't move. It didn't chase her. But Emily could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence, following her even as she ran up the stairs and out into the night. The cold night air hit Emily like a slap as she stumbled outside, gasping for breath. Her heart was still racing, the blood pumping in her ears as if her body were trying to outrun the terror that had consumed her. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't afford to. The figure, the thing from the mirror, it was still there in the basement watching her. She could feel its presence, lingering like a dark cloud, even as she tore up the stairs and out the door. But there was no time to think. The man who had saved her, the one who had called her name, was already moving toward her. His figure was blurred in the dim light, but she could make out the lines of his face, drawn, tired, but somehow familiar. The air around them seemed to shimmer, a low hum pulsing in the distance, almost like the aftershock of an explosion. "Emily, you need to come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. She froze, still too shaken to process his words. Who are you?" He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the empty street around them as if searching for something. Or someone. "There's no time for explanations. Not yet. They'll be here soon." Her mind raced. Who was they? And why had he come for her now? She barely understood what had just happened, what the mirror had shown her, what the figure had wanted, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't stay here. She swallowed hard, gathering her breath, her mind foggy with confusion. What do you mean? What's happening? Who's after me?" He glanced at the ground as if wrestling with his own words, then met her gaze. "It's the hour, Emily, the vanishing hour. It comes for everyone who dares to seek the truth. And tonight it's come for you." The words hit her like a punch, but she barely had time to react before he grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the house. "No, you don't understand. I need to know what's going on." Emily tried to pull back, but his grip was firm, unyielding. There was something in his eyes, a deep, desperate urgency that made her heart skip a beat. "Please, you don't have much time." He led her down the street, away from the house and into the darkness of the alley behind it. There, hidden by the shadows, was an old, rusted car. It looked like something from another time, its paint chipped, the tires flat, but still somehow intact. It didn't seem like the kind of car anyone would use to escape a ghostly pursuit, but Emily wasn't in a position to argue. She climbed into the passenger seat without question as the man jumped into the driver's side and slammed the door. As the engine sputtered to life, the car jerked forward, the tires spinning against the gravel, its headlights cutting through the night. Emily gripped the seat, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her voice more desperate this time. "Why are you helping me?" He was silent for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel, eyes focused on the road ahead. Finally he spoke, his voice low, but heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. "My name is Noah, and I've been trying to stop this for a long time." "Stop what?" "The vanishing hour," he repeated, his eyes flicking briefly to hers. "It's not just some legend. It's real. It's a curse. Anyone who gets too close to the truth about the mirrors, the way they connect to what lies beyond, they become targets. And now you're one of them. The words hit her like ice water to the face. A curse? Mirrors? Beyond? Her mind struggled to comprehend what he was saying. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had never believed in curses or supernatural forces. But what she had seen in that basement, what had reached out to her from the mirror, had made her question everything. The figure, its hollow eyes, its twisted smile. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an illusion. This isn't just some random event, Emily, Noah continued, his voice strained. The mirror you found, it's part of something much bigger. Something older. And there are people, others, who have been trying to control it, to use it for their own purposes. I've been tracking them for years. Emily turned her head toward him, her mind struggling to process his words. What do you mean? Who's trying to control it? The others, Noah said, his voice sharp, filled with anger. The ones who have been using the mirrors to open portals, to manipulate the very fabric of reality. They think they can control the vanishing hour. But the truth is, they don't understand what they're dealing with. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she remembered the cold, empty eyes of the figure in the mirror. The thing I saw, it wasn't just a reflection, was it? It came from the mirror. Noah's eyes darkened, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter. It was never just a reflection. The mirror isn't a window to the past, it's a doorway. And every time someone steps too close, every time they make the mistake of trying to unlock its secrets, the hour grows stronger. The vanishing hour feeds on those who seek it. Emily's stomach churned, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. So what happens now? What do I do? Noah took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. We have to stop the mirror. Destroy it before it's too late. If we don't, you won't just be a target, you'll become part of it. The hour will claim you and you'll vanish. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air between them. Emily's mind raced with questions, with confusion, with fear. But one thing was clear, she couldn't go back. The moment she had touched that mirror, her life had changed forever. And now, she was in a race against time to stop whatever was coming for her, and for everyone else who had been drawn into the curse of the vanishing hour. The car rumbled down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had descended over the countryside like a suffocating blanket. Emily's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the tension. Noah didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if his mind was somewhere far beyond the steering wheel. Emily could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on her. Her head was spinning with questions. Questions that felt like they were stacking on top of one another, but there was no time to ask. Every second felt like it could be her last. Where are we going? She finally managed to ask, her voice quiet but determined. You said we had to stop the mirror, but where? Noah didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every movement in the night. The fog seemed to deepen, swirling around them as if the world itself was closing in. The air felt heavy, thick with something ancient and oppressive. We're heading to the only place that might have the answers, he said, his voice rough. The old church on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for years, but there's a library beneath it. Hidden records, documents. We need them. Emily frowned. A church? A library? Nothing about this situation made sense, but she had no choice but to trust Noah. The figure in the mirror, whatever it was, had come for her once, and she knew it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted, or until she was swallowed whole by the vanishing hour. The road twisted and turned, winding through the dense forest that bordered the town. Emily's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following them, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. No headlights. No movement. Yet the feeling of being watched never left her. It was as if the very air around her was alive, breathing, waiting. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? She asked, her voice sharper now, trying to break through the tension that gripped the car. Why not explain what was going on when you first showed up? Noah's jaw clenched. I couldn't. Not yet. You wouldn't have believed me. Hell, I barely believe it myself sometimes. Emily turned toward him, her brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? You've been tracking this for years and you still don't understand it? Noah let out a bitter laugh. You don't understand. The vanishing hour isn't something you can just study in books. It doesn't follow the rules. It's not bound by time or space or logic. It feeds on the curiosity of those who seek it. The more you know, the more you want to know. Until it takes everything from you. Emily's mind reeled. She had no frame of reference for what he was describing, but his words felt too real, too heavy to dismiss. And if the fear in his eyes was anything to go by, he wasn't lying. The vanishing hour was something that couldn't be understood, only survived. The car swerved slightly as Noah turned onto a narrow gravel road, the wheels crunching loudly against the stones. Emily's breath caught in her throat as they approached a dark silhouette in the distance, the old church. It loomed in the fog, its broken steeple jutting into the night sky like a finger pointing toward an unknown fate. Noah parked the car at the edge of the overgrown lot, cutting the engine with a soft thud. The silence that followed was suffocating, almost unnatural. They both sat still for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over them like a storm waiting to break. "Stay close," Noah muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let the fog swallow you. Don't let it pull you in." Emily nodded, not fully understanding what he meant, but she didn't ask. She followed him out of the car and into the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The church itself was a crumbling shell of its former self, the stone walls chipped and cracked, the windows boarded up, casting the interior in total blackness. Yet there was an undeniable pull, something inside calling to her. They moved toward the side of the church, where an old iron door stood half ajar, rusted hinges creaking in protest as Noah pushed it open. A chill swept over Emily as she stepped inside, the temperature dropping even further, as if the air itself was growing colder in the presence of whatever lay beyond. Inside, the space was vast, silent except for the echo of their footsteps. Rows of empty pews stood like forgotten sentinels, their wood darkened by age and neglect. The stench of mildew and rot lingered, mixing with something darker, something foul. "Down here," Noah said, his voice reverberating off the stone walls as he led her toward a trapdoor at the far end of the church. It was hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, the wooden edges worn from years of disuse. Noah knelt and lifted it with surprising ease, revealing a set of narrow, spiraling stairs leading downward into the black void. Emily hesitated. Something in her gut twisted with unease, but she swallowed it down. She had no choice now. She couldn't turn back. With one last glance at the desolate church above, Emily followed Noah into the depths below. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls closing in on them as if the earth itself was trying to bury them alive. Every step felt heavier, as if the darkness was trying to drag her down, to pull her into its depths. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with old bookshelves, each one sagging under the weight of forgotten knowledge. Noah moved to the far wall, where a small desk sat against the stone, cluttered with papers and yellowed maps. He began rifling through the documents, muttering to himself as Emily stood in the doorway, trying to shake off the cold feeling that clung to her. "This is it," Noah said suddenly, his voice sharp, and Emily looked up to see him holding a small leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age, the cover cracked and worn. He flipped it open, revealing a series of cryptic symbols, diagrams of mirrors, and pages filled with strange, incomprehensible writing. "This is the key," he said, his fingers tracing over the text. "The key to understanding what the vanishing hour really is." Emily stepped closer, peering over his shoulder at the book. Her fingers hovered over the symbols, a strange sense of recognition stirring deep within her. But before she could ask him more, a sound, soft, distant, reached her ears. It was the faintest echo of something, footsteps. Noah's head snapped up, his face paling. "They're here." The distant footsteps grew louder, unmistakably approaching. Emily's heart raced as she glanced at Noah, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide with panic. His grip tightened around the ancient book, but his gaze never left the door to the library. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen as though something was waiting, something hungry. "We don't have much time," Noah whispered, his voice strained. "The vanishing hour is drawing closer. We need to destroy the mirror before it's too late." Emily's mind raced. The mirror that had begun this entire nightmare. The one that had pulled her into a world where time twisted, where shadows had a life of their own. The mirror had shown her a reality that felt just out of reach, a place where she couldn't escape, couldn't hide. She glanced around the small room. The walls were lined with shelves of old, brittle books, and the faint smell of dust and mildew hung thick in the air. There was nothing here to help them fight the oncoming storm, except the knowledge contained in the pages of that ancient book Noah had found. "Tell me what we need to do," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her chest. Noah didn't hesitate. He flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over the symbols as if he could feel their power pulsing beneath his skin. "This," he muttered, pointing to a symbol near the back of the book. It looked like a mirror etched with intricate markings, but beneath the design were lines of text in a language Emily couldn't understand. "This is a ritual," Noah continued, "a way to sever the connection to the mirror, to the vanishing hour. But it requires something important, a sacrifice." Emily's stomach dropped. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Noah's face darkened, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I wasn't sure it would come to this. I thought we'd have more time, but now there's no choice." A loud thud echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the sound of footsteps halting. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she moved closer to Noah, instinctively pulling him into a tighter circle. "What sacrifice are you talking about?" Emily repeated, her voice now trembling. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as if time itself was compressing, making it impossible to breathe. Noah's gaze softened, but his resolve never wavered. "The mirror is part of an ancient power, a power that's tied to the fabric of time itself. If we don't destroy it now, we'll both be trapped in the vanishing hour forever. The only way to sever that connection is to give something of ourselves. A piece of our soul, Emily. I'm sorry, but it's the only way." Emily took a step back, her hands shaking as she processed what he was saying. A piece of her soul? How could that even be possible? And why hadn't he told her sooner? She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the sound of the footsteps grew closer, closer still. "We don't have time," Noah urged. "If we don't act now, it will be too late. I'll take the burden. You've already suffered enough." "No," Emily snapped, her voice more confident than she felt. "I won't let you carry it alone." Before Noah could protest, there was a sudden crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of the library door swinging open. A dark figure stepped into the threshold, tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that glowed a faint, eerie red. It was the same figure from the mirror, the one who had haunted her every step since that fateful night. "Noah." "Emily," the voice was low, almost a whisper, but it vibrated with power. "You can't escape what's already been set in motion." Emily's blood ran cold. She tried to move, tried to push past Noah, but her legs felt like lead. The figure was impossibly still, standing in the doorway like a statue. The temperature dropped further, the room growing colder with each passing second. "It's too late," the figure continued, its voice echoing through her mind. "The vanishing hour has already begun. Time doesn't bend for the weak, and neither do we." Noah stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "You won't win. Not tonight. This ends now." The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. Instead, it raised one hand, and the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural presence. "We'll see about that," the figure murmured. Before Emily could comprehend what was happening, Noah raised the book high, and a flash of light erupted from it, blinding her. The room trembled as the book's pages seemed to glow with an ethereal fire. The figure recoiled, its form flickering as if it were being torn apart by the light. "No!" The figure howled, but the light only grew brighter, intensifying, filling the room with blinding warmth. In that moment, Emily understood what Noah had meant by sacrifice. She couldn't hesitate. There was no more time for questions, for doubts. She reached for the mirror symbol in the book, her fingers trembling as she pressed her palm against it. The ground beneath them shook as if the very foundation of the church was being ripped apart. The mirror from the other world began to crack, lines of light running through its surface like lightning. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure let out one last bone-chilling scream before vanishing entirely, its form dissipating into the light. The shadows lifted, the oppressive air lightened, and the room seemed to breathe again. The pressure that had weighed down on them lifted, leaving nothing but the echo of silence in its wake. For a long moment, Emily stood still, unable to believe it was over. The book dropped from Noah's hands, its pages flicking like a dying flame. They both stood in the aftermath, breathless, unsure of what to do next. "I didn't know if we could do it," Noah whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know if we could truly escape." Emily glanced at him, the relief in her chest slowly pushing away the fear that had been suffocating her. We did it, together. Noah nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound respect. Yeah, we did. They stood in silence for a long while, the weight of everything they'd experienced settling between them. The horrors of the vanishing hour, the twisted mirror, the figure from another world. It was over. But as Emily stepped out of the crumbling church and into the calm of the night, a strange heaviness lingered in her chest. The vanishing hour was gone, but so was a part of her. And though she had escaped the dark mirror's grasp, the memory of it, the feeling of being hunted, would stay with her forever. It was a part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her soul, a constant reminder that time, once broken, could never truly be repaired.